Yeah, well, I'm not going back unless I can have a sex change first. But I think it's very comfortable to return to a period where you've rummaged before. My forthcoming novel, Climaxes in 1665, which was the setting of my first novel. And it was lovely, actually, for once, to feel like you knew something about, that you weren't starting, it wasn't, the Emirate and Sevilla, and trying to find a whole bunch of new sources. So it was like returning to an old friend's house in a way. And I do love that period when the superstitious mind is starting to succumb to the modern mind and the cynicism of a lot of that time, because so many certainties have been overthrown, at least in England. You've had regicide and you've had revolution and you've tossed out one set of, manners of worship and re-embraced another. So it's a particularly lovely time, and then to take those ideas and bring them to Cambridge here was great.
Well, maybe we should open up to questions from the audience or questions among yourselves. Could you introduce yourself and say where you are from?
Linda Thorson from Harvard Extension School. I'm a student of Don's, actually. And my question is for Don and for Jane, and maybe for anybody else who wants to comment. Has your experience with fiction changed your teaching? And if so, how? And also, for those of you who've been teaching with fictional materials for a long time, what kinds of changes have you observed in the way you approach it or in the way your students react? Obviously, doing a history class is a little different from doing an FA, but I'm sure that the ways we blend together in the classroom change over
time. I have used fiction in my teaching quite a bit, and I must say I have to give credit to Father Francis Murphy, who was a professor at Boston College, and he taught the Western Civ 1500 survey, and he used fiction, among which was Voltaire's Candide, which is kind of startling if you think about it. But some students, I think, have a little bit more of a problem in that fiction is being used to get a fiction, a novel like Ignazio's Salome's Bread and Wine, being used to get at an understanding of the culture of a place and a time. I think the only difference in my teaching is that I no longer feel so apologetic about it as I did initially. I feel that I have to explain it. It's been such a valuable tool over the years. It's part of the kit now.
How lucky you are to have Don as a teacher. I guess I've become more passionate about the intellectual and academic utility of the daydreaming moment, which I feel is something that was burned out of me in graduate school with a red-hot poker. The sort of idle question of not just what would I have done, but even what was it like, so that the empathic impulse and even the expository impulse is purged from too much of our teaching. So I want students to follow that impulse in a rigorously scholarly way, but to create a classroom space where what was it like is as important as what does it mean. I read an awful lot. I'm on the editorial board of the American Historical Review, grateful as sponsors of this conference. And I read scores of editorial submissions a year. And so many more articles tell me what something meant than what it is. You know, the proportion of meta commentary to exposition to fascination, it's an inverted pyramid. I read, especially unsuccessful submissions, that never actually tell me what it is that they're talking about because they tell me so much about what it meant. So I guess a privileging of not making more important that daydreaming moment, but introducing it back into the possible things that could bring us into an encounter with history.
Yes.
I'm Sarah Mazza at Northwestern University. I had a question about creating the language in which historical characters speak and think. And, it's in response to Jane Kamensky's saying, something about creating the souls of the past, and Geraldine Brooks's comment about, well, assuming a uniformity of emotional experience. As an enthusiastic reader of historical novels and viewer of historical films, I find that I disconnect. The ones that don't work for me are the ones where suddenly a character in the 17th or 18th century is saying something like, "We have issues," or something that is so not true to how people would have thought or talked. And to me, that's much more important than the authenticity of the contextual detail, is the authenticity of the way people behave and talk and think. And, I'm a little bit at odds with Geraldine Brooks. I mean, I think we can't know about whether people had identical emotional experiences, although it's perfectly legitimate to assume it, I think, but what is, to me, most extraordinarily moving and powerful about good historical fiction, thinking like, my best reading experience last year, Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, is that there's a way of processing basic experiences, of underreacting to certain things we would overreact to, for instance, that is what makes for the emotional power of historical fiction or historical films. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that, how you recreate those kind of psychic and linguistic structures and convey the difference and the similarity at the same time, and whether people agree with me that the difference is, to me, I mean, there's, again, where I disagree. I mean, to me, the difference is emotionally moving rather than the similarity.
I love that hunt for the authentic way of expression. And I'll just share an anecdote from a fellow novelist, Jim Trace, who told me about researching his book Quarantine, set in biblical Israel. And to research it, he went on a camping trip with a Bedouin guide. And the first morning, the guide woke him up with a cup of cardamom-scented coffee and said, "Mr. Jim, how did you sleep?" And I said to him, "Ahmed, I slept like a log." And then he said he looked around the bare rock-ribbed hillside of the desert. No logs. So he turned to his guide and said, "Ahmed, how did you sleep?" And he said, "Mr. Jim, I slept like a dead donkey." And so ever since he told me that, I've always thought that my job was to turn logs into dead donkeys. And this last novel I finished comes in the wake of the thing that I love most in the world. If my house was burning down, I'd save my children, my dogs, my photograph albums, and my historical thesaurus of the English language, which is the most wonderful deep dive that you can have. I have a character who has a miscarriage, and I'm thinking, what would the midwife term the fetus? I'm sure she didn't call it a fetus, so I'm able to look it up and find out that she called it a shapeling.
So dying to talk about Wolf Hall. Any place, anytime. And I think it's a wonderful example of the kind of verisimilitude of voice that and it's verisimilitude, it's a simulacrum, not an authenticity. She sounds everything and nothing like the 16th century, right? It's Hemingway. It's so emotionally right, and yet the idiom, which, since I'm not a Tudor scholar, seems more real to me than Tudor speech, is completely of her own coinage, as is your 1665 and our 1764 and Arthur Miller's 1692, which I think is better 17th century writing than 17th century writing. To me, the idiom is a key part of what's transporting, but it's not the documentary world we live in, because that doesn't transport even us, really, right? Like, we translate it in our own heads as we read it. So it's the turn of phrase or the rhythm. You know, Crucible has such marvelously archaic inflection, and yet the coinages are largely his own, or an amalgam of things that he stole and imagined and filtered through beat poetry. So I just think Mantell is such a telling example, because it's so right, and yet a Tudor scholar would tell you it's nothing like what people sounded like. It's better. Yeah.
As a historian who really struggles to put herself in the mind of the individuals that she writes about, I'd like to ask each of you to comment on the line between history and fiction. Because in some respects, I'm also an avid reader of historical fiction, and hope to be one day a writer of historical fiction. I'm not sure that I understand where the line is. A good historical novel presents the history well, and I think good historical writing also, in a sense, creates fiction about the life of an individual that we can never know. So I'd ask for you for comments on that.
I mean, that's the core question, right, in a sense. It's what we started with, the issue of, between accuracy and invention. And I wish I could answer it. I wish I could give you, there's the line. And it's not even that it's not a bright line, it's that I think the line moves for me. It moves depending on the material that I'm engaging with. But I wanted to, I'm not sure this answers the question, but it speaks to something that's important to me as well, that we are, this is the heart of all these questions about, are these people of the past like us, or is the difference which is moving? And of course, it seems like a word like Shakespeare. Yeah, great, fantastic. Feels as though you could write a whole book from that. It's wonderful. So the difference, I think, is engaging, thrilling, exciting. But one of the things, the similarities that are interesting, and we haven't touched on yet, but I know something that was one of the subjects in my questions as well, is the relationship of that material to the present at the same time, right? It's always this double vision of the past and of the present. It goes to that question that Jane asked earlier on about the status of historical fiction for fiction writers, right? And I think at a certain level there is I don't think this level has validity, but there's a danger of us being tarred and feathered by bodice rippers in a certain sense. Right? There's also a kind of slightly better, but nonetheless, I think to me even more frustrating sense pops up. There are a lot of, and I did this too, a lot of British novels about the Second World War. There's a lot of them. You could argue it's a little subgenre, or it's a little fashion in certain ways. And so, when my book was coming out, there was a certain kind of, well, why would you write about this? Why not write a story set in the present? For me, it felt so compelling to write about prisoners of war held at the end of the war. I started that novel in 2000, but it took a long time to write. I was saying to Joan, to my embarrassment, it took longer to write the book than the Second World War lasted. But once we were at war, once I was writing that book after September 11th, 2001, once we had prisoners of war, that book became very different to me. And one of the reasons it took so long is because I had to reorient my thinking about it in certain ways. So that's another way in which that line can move in complicated ways, it seems to me. But I'm always interested in how the past reflects on the present, while at the same time being wary of turning a book into political allegory. And that was something I struggled with a great deal in the book as well. I'm not sure that I altogether succeeded in grappling with that question, but it was one of the reasons, again, it took a long time to